I had the pleasure of providing the Speaker of the House of Commons with my recommendations report following the 2019 and 2021 general elections. The report includes 32 recommendations for legislative changes that, in my opinion, would improve Canada's electoral process. I would note at the outset that Canada enjoys a healthy electoral democracy based on an electoral framework that continues to earn the confidence of Canadian electors. At a time when there's much concern about democratic regression around the world, surveys show that Canadians overwhelmingly believe that our elections are free and fair and that they trust their election results. This enviable position is due, at least in part, to the fact that the Canada Elections Act has been the subject of periodic reviews. So today's report is part of this important tradition of continued improvement. It marks the beginning of a conversation not only with parliamentarians, but also, I hope, with interested Canadians about the evolution of our electoral framework and its ability to meet new challenges and changing expectations. My report is in two parts. The first addresses a range of issues that relate to the regulation of electoral communications in the digital age. The second deals with a range of topics related to the administration of the election and services to electors and candidates. Together, the recommendations seek to make the electoral process more transparent, more resilient, and more accessible to all electors and candidates. My recommendations on electoral communications predominantly aim at increasing the transparency of electoral engagement by parties, candidates, and third parties via digital media. The Canada Elections Act, at least much of it, was drafted at a time when electoral communications took place mostly in print media, radio, and TV advertising. So it leaves aside a broader range of digital communications such as text messages, online videos, or web pages. It is time to revisit the regime to ensure that it captures a broader range of electoral communications and allows electors to know who's speaking to them during an election. Transparency of electoral campaigns would also benefit from ensuring that digital platforms publish their policies on advertising and content moderation prior to an election, and improving the election advertising registry requirements introduced in 2018 so as to allow for a comprehensive view of the ads sponsored by the parties and other participants. My report also makes a number of recommendations that these are difficult topics that simply cannot be ignored, even though the solutions may be imperfect. I've made a number of recommendations that seek to increase the resiliency of our electoral democracy in the face of such challenges, and I look forward to working with parliamentarians to build on my recommendations. Finally, a number of recommendations seek to improve voter services, to remove barriers, and increase opportunities for all electors to exercise their right to vote. For instance, several recommendations seek different avenues to reduce the number of late mail-in ballots, as we saw in the last election. This includes, for example, allowing pre-read applications for special ballots, moving the deadline for candidate nominations, and extending the minimum length of the election period for a non-fixed election, fixed-date election from 37 to 44 days. Another recommendation aims at avoiding situations such as the one that occurred in 2019, where a fixed-date election was in conflict with an important religious holiday. Finally, there are a number of measures to better serve electors in long-term care facilities and those requiring assistance to vote. While this report contemplates a number of improvements to our electoral process, it is also important to note that not all improvements require legislative changes. For instance, the last election showed the need for improvements in how we engage with and offer services to Indigenous Canadians. This can be pursued within the existing regime, and work in that area has begun, but it will be essential to listen to Indigenous communities as we seek to make improvements. I also note potential changes that are not in this report and that relate to elements of the supply and confidence agreement reached by the Liberal and New Democratic parties, dealing with 2 additional days of voting, as well as allowing electors to vote anywhere in their electoral district. This does not mean that those proposals should not be pursued, but merely that discussions on the way to achieve the desired outcomes and the timeframes for doing so are just beginning. And I would be certainly happy to discuss these matters further with parliamentarians in order to consider various options and establish milestones moving forward. This report, as I indicated at the outset, is the beginning of an important conversation with parliamentarians and Canadians on ways to improve our electoral process. It is a critical exercise that we must periodically undertake to ensure the vitality of our democracy in the face of evolving circumstances, challenges, and aspirations. So thank you, and I will now take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Perrault. Can I just ask you to tilt your microphone down right in front of you? Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you very much. So, all right. So if you are on Zoom, please use the raise hand function on your system there, and we will get to you after we work through the questions that we have here in front of us in the room. And I assume, Ms. Lawson, you're also available for questions as well? Perfect. All right. So we'll start first, please, with Ashley Burke from CBC News. Go ahead.
Good morning. My first question is about one of your recommendations is to make it illegal to spread false information specifically about the voting process. Are there some examples that you can provide of that happening in Canada and what your concerns are?
We've all heard misinformation or incorrect information, and I don't want today to be giving out specific examples that would fit what I'm proposing here, because that would be making assumptions about the knowledge and the intent of people making those declarations. So I'll stay away from concrete examples that we saw, but certainly, to me, this is about drawing a line in the sand on a matter of principle. It is not okay to deliberately undermine our electoral process by spreading information that a person knows to be false, and to do that for the purpose of undermining the process. So that is an important statement of principle, and we need to have parameters that ensures the integrity of our electoral process against this kind of behavior.
And when it comes to political parties that promote hatred, why now ask for legislation to address this? What are you seeing? Are you seeing a rise in complaints? Are you seeing a rise in groups that are trying to apply for party status that's concerning? Why now?
So, I mean, we have seen a rise in terms of ideologically motivated violent extremism and hate speech. That's been reported upon most recently by the director of CSIS, for example. So we are seeing a rise. We have had an instance in the past where there was a party application that did give rise to complaints and serious allegations. There is currently no mechanism in place right now to address this issue. So if there is a hate group that wishes to register as a party, right now it could do so, and in so doing would gain access to a number of benefits: party lists, electoral lists, free television, tax credits on contributions. So this is illegal speech as we speak. This is not a matter of making new illegal speech, but it's a matter of protecting the electoral process from that and having a mechanism in place that does not involve the Chief Electoral Officer in what could at some point be partisan disputes.
Okay, Christian Noël, Radio-Canada, à vous la parole.
Christian Noël, Radio-Canada, you have the floor. Question. My question in French will be about the same thing roughly as the question asked by Ashley. Why is it important to have a procedure that blocks these groups from representing as political groups? Answer. Well, this way they would get certain privileges, a certain standing, a certain platform, tax credits in terms of the contributions made to them, and privileged access to broadcasting, privileged access to a list of electors. So there's a whole set of benefits to be gained by registering as a political party. So we've seen a rise in hate speech. Therefore, there need to be mechanisms in place, which we don't have right now, to prevent this from happening. And it is a high threshold. It's not just about having an individual member of a political party that has had unfortunate statements. No, we're talking about a political party who would have the fundamental objective of disseminating hate speech. So to prevent this from happening, we have to have mechanisms, in my opinion. So these groups will not be eligible, we should say this, to become registered parties. The report you presented to MPs today, to the parliamentarians today, takes into account certain threats that come with the switch to the digital age and some shortcomings that you're trying to rectify. What are these fundamental threats or shortcomings? The report covers a wide range of subjects. It's about recalibrating the regime of third parties that has evolved over the years to improve accessibility, but among other things, it also aims to encounter certain threats. I mentioned this briefly in my opening remarks, the financing from third parties. We have been looking at it for a while now. There aren't easy solutions, but we need to make sure that we are reducing the risk of foreign financing from becoming part of our elections process through third parties. So how do we make sure that we have mechanisms to face misinformation situations, deliberate misinformation situations to undermine the electoral process? Question, how do you make up for these shortcomings then? Answer, well, there are multiple recommendations when it comes to third parties. What I indicate in the report is that there needs to be a distinction between third parties that are corporate entities, labor unions that have common activities and income in Canada and which can continue to use their own income to finance electoral regulated activities. But when we think about organizations that are kept alive by contributions and donations, at least a significant chunk of their income, if it comes from these sources, these groups can register as third parties and indicate some of their revenues as their own revenues. These can be declared as their own revenues. So this can come from other groups. In Canada, this income I mean from abroad, there is no means for us to track this. So what I'm proposing is a mechanism to make sure that only contributions of only Canadian citizens or permanent residents would go in terms of financing third parties.
Globe and Mail, please go ahead.
Hi there, good morning. I'm interested in late mail-in ballots or special ballots, excuse me, and in particular the changes between 2019 and 2021 going up from 1.5% to 7.3% of all special ballots becoming late and not counted. And I'm curious, if you could talk a bit about, more than, 90,000 people whose ballots weren't counted, like what we know about those people and if they're from certain parts of the country, or I know you referenced remote communities or in your report, and if you could just say a bit about that.
First and foremost, what we know is they tend to be people who applied fairly late in the process for a special ballot. So by the time they received the ballot and the time they return it, it did come in late. I think you touched a finger on something important, which is the comparison with 2019, where we had the same regime in place. And of course, smaller volumes, but that does not impact percentages of late ballots. And the key difference was 4 days. So that's, in a world of snail mail, 4 days makes a big difference. And that's why one of the recommendations is to extend, in certain circumstances where there is not a fixed date, extend by a small period the length of the election. But there are many other ways of achieving an important reduction in the number of mail-in ballots. And so I have a range of recommendations in my report to address that. It's quite possible to address this problem by selecting a few of those recommendations, not necessarily all of them.
With respect to that, an extra 4 days, do you believe that in the most recent election that the vast majority of those ballots could have been counted with an extra 4 days?
I don't have exact numbers, but certainly, yes, the vast majority came trickling in the days immediately after polling day. So yes, that would make a big difference. But again, there are many factors that play into the calculus of the length of the election. I'm not making that decision. And so there are other ways, even in a short election period, to facilitate mail-in ballots. And that includes pre-registration. It includes changes in the date of candidate nominations. It includes allowing an electorate to vote for a party, not just a candidate, so that early in the campaign, BC has that, and they process most of their mail-in applications well before close of nominations. And they have a much lower rate of late ballots. So there are many, many ways of making improvements to the regime to reduce late mail-in ballots.
Was there an observable geographic trend at all with respect to the late ballots?
I don't believe that there was an observable geographic trend overall. There were certainly variations between ridings, but nothing that points to a particular trend.
All right, thank you. So we'll now go to Zoom. Just a reminder, if you are on this call, to please raise your hand so that I can get to you. I see a number of you joining in, but you haven't raised your hand, so I'm not sure if you do want to ask a question. We'll start with Marie Wolf from the Canadian Press. Go ahead.
Yeah, hello. You mentioned misinformation and foreign interference. I just wondered if you could give us your assessment of how serious a problem you believe this is, and where you think this interference is coming from specifically.
So I'm not particularly interested as Chief Electoral Officer in where, in terms of whether it's foreign or domestic. My main concern is on misinformation about the voting process. I'm not interested in what may be characterized as misinformation on party platforms, the candidates' positions on political matters, but really on misinformation and disinformation, which is deliberate misleading of electors on the voting process. We already have some measures in the legislation to deal with that. Following the robocalls scandal many years ago, there were provisions added to that for impersonation. We have pre-existing provisions where it causes interference with the vote. But there's nothing right now in the legislation where there is a deliberate campaign to undermine the process or undermine confidence in the results of that process. So this complements a number of existing provisions. For the most part, though, our role is to inform Canadians and react to misinformation or confusion online and push out correct information about the voting process. So that is the main of our efforts, but there needs to be some legal parameters, I think, to address the growing trend of mis and disinformation.
Follow up, Marie?
Yeah, I wondered if you could give us some idea of the parameters that could be put in place when it comes to making false statements. Because as everyone knows, during an election, there's constant commentary about whether it's worth voting. People make statements about candidates all being the same. Not all of these statements are strictly accurate. But would they have to come within the parameters of the Act and count as a false statement? Or what sort of things are you trying to capture here?
No, that's a good question. And it's important to realize that what I'm trying to capture here is a very narrow category of misleading statements. So it has to be deliberate. It has to be for the purpose of undermining trust in the process or the results. And it has to be on the electoral process per se. So, for example, if somebody's saying that we're using tabulators that count or discount certain votes predominantly, of course, neither of that is true. We don't use tabulators, and if we did, there's nothing wrong with tabulators, but not ones that would discount certain votes. So if we have narratives of that nature that seek to deliberately undermine trust in the results of an election or trust in the process, then there needs to be a measure in the legislation to clearly indicate that this is not acceptable in our electoral democracy.
Okay, the next question is from Karina Roman, CBC News. Go ahead.
Yes, hi there. You have a number of recommendations. I'm wondering, since it's up to parliamentarians to take it on and decide whether to go forward with any of them, whether you could prioritize for us, if you had to pick sort of the most important ones to get done soon in time for the next election, what would you choose?
I don't have a good answer to that question. I think we'll work with parliamentarians to examine those recommendations, see which ones they feel are more pressing. Certainly, I do feel that we need a number of safeguards to protect our electoral process. But I do think the recommendations around communications in the digital age are overdue. I think our Elections Act needs to be modernized. I do think we need to recalibrate the third-party regime in some ways to make it simpler, more coherent, but also to address funding by third parties. So that, I think, is an important area of reform in my mind.
Follow up, Karina?
Yeah, so when you talk about overdue, I guess for any of them, I'm wondering if, we will have future elections. This is based on actually 2 elections that have already happened. Do you have a warning to Canadians and parliamentarians about what will happen to our democracy and our elections if these recommendations are not acted upon?
I think these are important recommendations, but at the same time, I would not want to give the impression that we are in a dire situation. As I said at the outset, we do have a healthy electoral framework. On the whole, Canadians trust our democracy in numbers that are quite encouraging. They continue to trust our electoral process despite the general trend in distrust in institutions. So we have a good process, but it needs to be recalibrated periodically, and this is part of what's happening now. So we'll need to take the time and look with Parliament at how we can improve our process and keep it up to date.
Okay. Does anybody have another question? We have a few more minutes left. If not, Christian Noel, vas-y.
En français, tout à l'heure, vous parliez de désinformation.
You were talking about disinformation on the integrity of the electoral process. Would this be a key recommendation? Well, I will leave it up to you to call it that or not. We have seen unfortunate circumstances across the country which do not encourage the electoral procedure. And I'm talking about deliberate attempts to undermine confidence. So we have to have measures to respond to this kind of behavior.
You just noted that there's a high level of trust in Canada, perhaps compared to other countries. But I'm curious if during the pandemic, at a time where we have seen a decline in trust in governments and institutions overall, if you've also noticed that when it comes to the electoral process.
No, it's a good question, and we have not. So overall, when you look at our surveys, 98% of electors found that the process is easy to go through, easy to vote. 91% of Canadians have trust in the process, trust in the administration of the election, and these are numbers that are very comparable to what we've had over the years. So they've been fairly steady. I think we have to be careful not to take those numbers for granted, though. I think we need to be vigilant, and we've seen declines in other areas, and we've seen declines in trust in democracy around the world. So we need to be alert to challenges. But overall, Canadians continue to trust our electoral process and our administration of elections.
Marcia?
Particularly in light of the pretty historic low turnout in Ontario's election, I'm curious if there are things that you have on the top of your mind with respect to encouraging high voter turnout at the federal level?
We know that by far, the main drivers of turnout are political. They're not within the parameters of election administrators. I think our role as administrators is to remove barriers, is to facilitate the process, and we have a number of recommendations to do that. We're also working on improvements outside of the legal framework or within the existing legal framework. But the overall dynamic of participation is by far mainly driven by political factors.
Okay, so this is the last call for people who are on Zoom. If you have another question, raise your hand now. I'll get you on. If not, then we will proceed. Okay, that appears to be all the questions we have for you today. Thank you so much for joining us. This concludes the press conference. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.